Hi, welcome to session 3 of the seventh topic of the semester, Modernity and Progress Comes to Texas. We're looking at a period of time, roughly speaking, at the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, starting about 1876 onwards. We're going to look at the remaining portion of the 19th century and an early portion of the 20th century as well, because during this period of time, Texas is now modernizing, is entering the modern age, which, by the way, is something that also the United States as a whole is also going through as well. The United States is modernizing, and the North is modernizing, the South, and modernity is also moving westward as well into the so-called Wild West. The Wild West has been developed as well. It's been settled and developed and modernized during this period of time. But here we're going to be just paying attention to Texas, okay? The state of Texas, okay? What, how, and why Texas decided to modernize, and how Texas was actually developing a modern economy and a modern society. And this is something that we can actually see more closely in this session, session number 3. In session 2, what we did was looking at the initial stepping stones of that modernization project, how Texas is moving into this modern age by, first and foremost, trying to develop railroads, modern systems of transportation. It was going to be very difficult, if not impossible, to modernize Texas without a modern system of transportation. In this case, we're talking about, this is the 19th century. So when we talk about modern or new transportation systems, people refer to railroads. Again, this is essential. If Texas is to move towards this new capitalist commercial market economy, industrial economy as well, it required a new system of transportation and kind of an industrial type of transportation. And that was, again, the railroads. The railroads will enable Texas to move raw materials, the resources that were actually extracted from Texas, like lumber, for example. We're going to talk about that actually in this session. Crops or cattle, you name it, what people are producing. So they can be transported, those resources can be transported to factories, so they can be transported to processing plants, refineries. We're going to talk about all of that actually in this third session. So the first stepping stone is railroad development. When we're looking at railroad development in the United States, this is the century of the railroad revolution. There's the Pacific railroads that were commissioned in 1862 by Congress that were moving westward. There were 4 lines. Again, we talked about that. And in Texas, again, we were going to see also companies also developing railroads as well. There were charter companies. The state of Texas actually commissioned a series of companies to develop railroads. It actually fostered development, incentivizing those railroad companies by giving them land, land grants, for example. Communities also funded rail lines as well, or granted subsidies to railroad companies like lands or tax exemptions of several kinds. And so, again, we're going to see now the great commercial centers of Texas being now interconnected. There's going to be a network of railroad development, rail lines that are going to connect the major commercial centers like Galveston, Houston, the Dallas-Fort Worth area, San Antonio, moving all the way to El Paso, okay, in the western fringes of Texas. And of course, there's going to be a railroad that is going to continue, the Southern Pacific, as it was known, that is going to continue all the way moving into California. So Texas is being now integrated into the national economy because when you build a railroad, by default, the state, in this case, Texas, is going to now be connected to the national market. That is to say that producers in Texas will be able to send products, send food products, for example, or cattle to the United States, so it can be sold, distributed all over the country. Okay, so we're now seeing the creation of a national market. Again, something we examined again in session 2. So after the railroads, we're going to see also Texas attempting to modernize by now moving into this commercial industrial economy. There's going to be a new economic system on the rise. New means modern, a modern economic system based on commerce, based on trade, based on industry. So what that means is that now people are moving into the market. Okay, people as a whole are going to be either working in enterprises that are producing products for the market, or people are going to be investing in creating businesses, shops, and enterprises of various kinds in order to actually produce products for the market as well. There's a demand of products, and what people are doing is simply trying to meet the demand. They're trying to supply that demand again by generating enterprises of various kinds. We're looking at in session 2 commercial agriculture, that agriculture, farming and agriculture, that sector of the Texas economy is going to modernize because it's going to now be more and more oriented towards the market. What farmers are doing is trying to grow crops for the market, cash crops, that is to say. Instead of just subsisting from the land and growing whatever foods that were growing in the past to sustain themselves, to sustain their families, they want to grow surplus grain, surplus products from the land in order to sell it on the market, to make money. In other words, they want to turn the land into a business venture, into an enterprise. Small farmers are doing that, and also large commercial landowners, investors, merchants are actually creating agricultural companies as well in Texas, trying to grow citruses, wheat, corn, and vegetables, etc., again, to supply the market as well. So agriculture in Texas is changing very rapidly in this modern age. It's becoming a business more and more. Okay, so now let's move forward with our discussion on Texas modernizing. And now we're going to look at another area of this commercial economy, this modern economy that Texas is going into, and that is that Texas is going to develop industries now. So agriculture had existed in Texas ever since, really going back to the Spaniards that colonized Texas. Of course, they introduced cattle ranching. The Spanish colonists in Texas introduced farming as well. So farming has been a main form of subsistence for the early colonists, the Spanish colonists, going back to the colonial period. The Mexican population, in the Mexican period, likewise, we're going to see many families subsisting from the land, of course. And when we see Texas becoming independent, and after the Texas Republic, it joins the Union, likewise, in that period of time, we're going to see that farmers, constituted a very large sector of the population. Farming was one of the primary forms of subsistence for individuals and families alike. But after Reconstruction, after 1876, after 1877, Texas is now moving towards industry. I mean, this is going to be something new, really totally new for Texas. We're going to see the rise of an industrial revolution in Texas. Okay. And so this industrial revolution is going to not just bring factories and industries and industrial plants, etc., to Texas, but it's going to bring a new economic system. Okay. And this economic system is known as industrial capitalism. Okay. So industrial capitalism is now coming to Texas, and it will become the mainstream, the dominant economic system of the state. Okay. Which is really the economic system of the United States, by the way. Okay, so this is, the United States is functioning now under an industrial capitalist system. The entire United States, again, functions under a single unified system. Okay, it's called industrial capitalism. And Texas is entering now this system. Precisely because the system of the past, based on agriculture, based on cash crop agriculture, is coming to an end in terms of the plantation system that used slave labor. Okay, that system in which Texas, as well as the other slaveholding states of the South, were simply growing cotton. Again, that was the main cash crop, again, of the South. In the main enterprise was the plantation. This is the most important economic enterprise of the South, in which the labor force were slaves. That system of cash crop agriculture based on plantation systems and slavery had come to an end. And now Texas, as well as the other states, the ex-Confederate states, are moving into this industrial capitalist system now. Okay, and so what industrial capitalism is going to do in Texas, as well as everywhere else, is introduce certain institutions, certain principles to guide the economy. Industrial capitalism is based on the idea that, we need to really allow individuals to generate wealth. Okay, this is wealth generation. That's what capitalism is. You have to free society, free individuals to pursue their own self-interest and try to generate wealth for themselves. So it's important that you allow them to own property. Okay, you have to allow individuals to actually own property. Okay, this is one of the pillars, one of the central pillars of capitalism is private property, by the way. But why is it important for individuals to own property? Is because if you're trying to build wealth, and that's the purpose of capitalism, wealth creation, and then you must be able to be allowed to own property for the purpose of using that property to create an enterprise. Okay, so you have to allow individuals to create all sorts of enterprises, all sorts of enterprise. Again, this is what is called free enterprise. Free enterprise, by the way. Okay, free enterprise. That is to say, if there's going to be a demand of some product, whether it's a food product, clothing item, whatever it is, somebody has to supply it. Somebody has to craft it. And that person is going to actually make a business, build an enterprise in order to actually create that product, whether it's a food product or otherwise, in order to supply the demand. Okay, because that individual is trying to build wealth through that enterprise, trying to sell products and trying to sell the product in order to, earn money, build wealth, that is to say. Okay, so very important. Again, what we're going to see here is now in Texas is this new institution, the institution of free enterprise. People will be now set free to pursue their own self-interest, and they're going to be allowed to actually own land or own resources. If they have the capital, if they have the money, they can actually buy it, and then they can actually invest in technology, move the technologies there in order to make an enterprise. In other words, build an enterprise, a free enterprise. And also, what capitalism introduces as well, it's called industrial capitalism. The other central pillar, the other principle is, what about people that don't have the capital to invest in an enterprise, to buy land and buy technology and the like? Well, if people don't have that capital, what they can do is that they can actually sell their labor. Okay, so they can actually work for the enterprises that are being generated and be hired there on a permanent basis and then earn wages. Again, so capitalism also introduced the idea of wage labor. And this is coming to Texas again, that more and more in the state of Texas, the way that people are going to earn their living is either by creating a business, okay, or an enterprise of some kind, however small or however large the enterprise will be, or by working for wages. Again, wage labor. You can work for a company or an industry or a business, etc. You can be hired permanently there, and then you can be paid a wage, and this is how you're actually going to make a living as well. Okay, it's called wage labor. So this is, again, a system that is now coming to Texas, particularly after 1876. And this is going to be now the economic system of Texas until the present day, by the way, until the 21st century. We're still, again, in the system. By the way, free enterprise and wage labor. This is how people subsist. This is how people make money. This is how people earn their living. In other words, there's the business owners, the shopkeepers, and so on. Or there's, again, people that actually work for those enterprises for wages. Okay. Society is being reorganized now. Okay. It's a whole different social and economic setting that is on the rise with the coming of the Industrial Revolution. This is an industrial revolution for Texas, by the way. Okay. So we're going to see an upsurge of shops, therefore, okay, industries, manufacturers, they're going to be on the rise. Again, this is going to be an upsurge now, particularly in the main large urban centers of Texas, like San Antonio, Dallas, for example, Austin, Fort Worth, El Paso, Houston, Galveston. We're going to see, again, an upsurge of shops, industries, and manufacturers. So much so that if we take into account, for example, just the statistics, in 1870, just before this industrialization wave is going to take place, there were only 2,400 manufacturers. They were very, very small, by the way. A manufacturer will hire maybe 3 or 4 people, perhaps even 10. That will be a large shop. Again, those were very, very small shops. But by 1890, there were already in Texas over 5,268 shops, industries, manufacturers. So again, this is a growing trend. Again, that there is industrialization taking place, okay, in the latter part of the 19th century. By 1890, 63% of the Texas economy was based on the industrial production. In other words, what industries, shops, manufacturers were producing and selling on the market, 63% of all the things that were produced in the state that were sold in the market came from industries. Okay, so more and more, the Texas economy is becoming now more based on industry. That is to say, than, let's say, in agriculture, even though agriculture is still very, very important. This is the second sector, again, of the Texas economy. But industry, the industrial sector is becoming primary, and now the agricultural sector is becoming quite secondary, but not that is being displaced altogether. Agriculture is still very, very central to the Texas economy, whether we're talking about citruses, vegetables, cotton, corn, etc. Again, still very, very important in Texas, okay? Commercial farming, okay? But this is something new, and it is growing so fast, industrialization that is really taking center stage when it comes to the economy. How the Texas economy is going to sustain itself, in other words, because this is going to provide the state a very reliable, very secure form of revenue. You tax industries in their products, in their sales, in their properties, and with that, you finance the state. And the exports of those products also is a source of revenue for the state, because the exports also are taxable as well. Okay, so more and more, the finances of the state are going to rely more and more, again, on industrial production. Okay, so at any rate, now let's look at the industries. So it's very important. Okay, so what kind of industries are we going to see on the rise in Texas that are really the most important for the Texas economy? And keep in mind that they are important not only because they're new, but because of the amount of people that are going to work there, that more and more the peoples of Texas are going to earn their living through what's called wage labor. Okay, that's why it's important that this is a new form of making a living. In other words, earning a wage. Okay, so uh, let's start number one. One of the first industries that when this industry flourished, it was actually the dominant one. It's not going to stay. It's not going to stay dominant, because as we'll see, it's going to be replaced later on, but by other industries that were more and more important, more profitable. But initially, the first industry that flourished, that really was the most dominant, was the lumber industry. Okay, there were significant, the numbers of. There's a region again in East and South Texas full of pine trees that were extremely rich in terms of the use of wood, the demand for wood. So because there was a growing demand for wood, not only within the state but also in the United States, we're going to see that there will be investors that are going to be buying lands or be granted concessions to actually mine those forests, the pine trees, in order to use the wood to sell the wood to different businesses, different enterprise within the state and out of state as well that were requiring the wood. One of them, of course, it was railroad construction. There's a lot of railroad construction, and railroads usually, were actually buying the wood for the construction of the rails again. So this is, again, a growing demand. Railroad companies were, for the most part, the ones actually buying. Okay, the wood. Then there's also, again, wood that was bought for building houses. There's a lot of construction work taking place. The houses back then in Texas were made out of wood, and again, there was a growing demand for this. Again, this raw material for construction work as well. Freight platforms, again, that were used as well in ports or that were used by the railroads as well, require, wood. And again, this is something that is being commercialized in Texas. The trees are valuable. They have a commercial value. Yeah. So what we see is the commercialization really of natural resources. Natural resources are being commercialized. They have a commercial value because you can actually craft something out of it that helps people do work or build homes or make businesses, etc. Okay, like wood, for example. Okay, another use for wood is for shipbuilding, for building ships as well, decks, and also for newspapers. Again, newspapers also use wood for actually printing news. And so the newspapers actually, again, are the ones that are really this main source of information and news. Back during this time, we're talking about the late 19th century. There's a number of newspapers in the state, in the United States, and they require, of course, wood to make the paper. Okay, so there was a value, again, on wood that allowed for individuals to create a free enterprise, and that enterprise initially was the lumber industry. By 1890, 7,000 people in Texas actually work in those lumber industries. Okay, so it was really a gigantic source of labor. Okay, and it was initially, as I said, it was a dominant industry. In the very early stages, let us just say from the 1870s to the end of the century, the lumber industry was dominant in the state of Texas. Okay, and another industry that is going to be arising is this a kind of like a secondary industry that was connected to the lumber industry were the lumber mills, the sawmills. In other words, this is where people are actually cutting the wood, etc., and they're packing it and they sell it, in stores and the like. Again, so this is another type of very small industry, the lumber mills, as they were called. Okay, the lumber mills. Again, it's not going to be as important as the lumber industries, but that also was another industry as well that is propping up in several places of Texas, particularly in the south and in the east. And this is another enterprise as well. This is another enterprise. There's people that own a lumber mill. They hire people. This is a source of employment as well, the lumber mills. There's also the salt industry. Okay. There's a demand for salt, and salt back then was used to preserve meat, to preserve food as well, for as a condiment as well. And because it was considered a preservative, a food preservative, and also a condiment. And it was used in industrial processes, actually, in the can industry. Again, in the food industry, people will actually use salt to preserve food products and vegetables, to make beef jerky, for example. Okay, that was very important. Beef jerky in Texas was the first protein bar, so to speak. You can actually carry a beef jerky if you're traveling around Texas, and if you're just survive on that and water, you're actually, you're going to be well off. It's not the ideal meal. This is not the ideal diet, but back in the 19th century, beef jerky was a very reliable source of protein intake that sustained life, when people had no other means of actually acquiring food, for example. Okay, and so the salt industry is also going to be significant. The Grand Saline Plant of 1889, this is when it was founded again, is also going to be yet another enterprise, again, of this industrial revolution that Texas is undergoing, is modernizing the state by really fostering the production, the generation of industries, okay, like the salt industry. The fourth industry are, the foundries again. This is where people are crafting metalworks, okay, is a more complex type of kind of the old blacksmiths. In other words, this is more complex. It has more technology, furnaces in which people use coal in order to smelt iron ore and other metals. And again, what people are doing actually are just, again, crafting metalworks, whether we're talking about horseshoes, for example, plows, agricultural tools of various kinds, and the like. Again, for ranching as well, there's certain tools that are required in ranching for branding animals and the like. Again, so the foundries were like local shops, if you will. It's like a small manufacturer that resemble the old blacksmiths, again, of the 18, 17, 1600s. Again, going back in Europe, the blacksmiths, again, they're the ones that were crafting ironworks. But now this is becoming quite more complex. They're larger shops. They have new technologies, new resources, and they have capital, and they're going to hire people in order to now craft metalworks, tools, hardware, etc. Again, on such a vast scale. Again, so this is not really, again, a large industry that is manufacturing thousands of units every month, but this is a start. Again, for Texas in the late 19th century, the foundries are going to be like the forerunners of the steel industry. This is not really a steel industry, but it's kind of like the baby step, again, moving towards a kind of iron or steel industry. Okay, the foundries as well. Okay, this is another industry. Now, there's another one, again, that is also going to arise, in particularly in East Texas, where the cotton is grown, particularly in East Texas around Houston area, Beaumont, there's going to be cotton plantations in the East and also in the Northeast. And what we're going to see in the Northeast are cotton gins, again, the cotton mills. What the cotton gin is simply a device that cleans cotton fiber. Because when cotton is picked during harvest time, it usually is very mushy. The cotton threads, the fiber is all like like a huge ball full of stems. It's full of mud or dirt, and it's very mushy, and it has to be separated and cleaned, by the way, in order to be weaved. So before the cotton is weaved, it needs to be cleaned and separated, in other words, okay? Which back in the 1800s, people did that by hand, okay? But in 1793, the cotton gin was invented by an American scientist. Let me just write it here, so we at least have the name here. Eli Whitney, again, in 1793, invented the cotton gin. He was from Massachusetts, and this is really going to be a device that helped really kickstart the first industrial revolution in the United States. The first industrial processes in the United States, in New England, was, again, cleaning cotton. And those were the cotton mills. Those were simply like warehouses. People had a cotton gin, and what the cotton gin is doing is it's a machine that cleans cotton extremely fast. So what took really 10 individuals to clean in a day, the cotton gin will do it in an hour. Okay, is more or less the ratio. 10 to 1, so to speak. 10 people will do that kind of work in a whole day, and the cotton gin will simply do it again in an hour. Rather fast, very fast. So this is what Texas is now doing. Is really investing. People are investing in shops or warehouses in which they have a cotton gin. They're cleaning the cotton fiber, and what they're doing is actually selling the clean cotton to the industries. And so, in many cases, what they're going to do is actually ship out the clean cotton again to the industries that are arising, they're propping up in other states, particularly in the southern states, but also in New England. So Texas is exporting clean cotton, because now they're, involved in, cleaning the cotton. It's part of an industrial process, by the way. This is another industry that is on the rise as well. Okay. So let us move forward then with another industry. The sixth industry are the grain mills. Again, there's going to be also mills that are going to ground seeds or grain, okay, such as flour, to make flour, for example. So there are going to be mills that are there's going to be farmers that are going to actually grow the flour. And in many cases, what they will do is actually sell it to merchants who are going to process it again into flour, to sell flour, to make bread, for example. Okay, bread is made from flour. So again, what we're going to see in Texas is now a new shop, a new kind of manufacturer in which they're simply grinding wheat to make flour, or they're grinding also cotton seed to make oil, like a cold press, if you will, to make oil as well. There's a demand for cotton oil as well. There's a demand overseas, and this is what investors in Texas are attempting to do as well. Okay, so it's really important again how Texas is now moving gradually, slowly but surely, into a more industrial economy. People are trying to either generate an enterprise to manufacture or craft some form of product that is on demand, that is valuable, that people pay money for, or they're trying to earn a job. They're trying to, earn a wage. They're trying to get a job in those enterprises in order to make a living. Okay. And so this is how, again, more and more Texas is more and more reorganized. Okay. Now there's another industry, okay, that is also going to be on the rise, that is not necessarily new. It's not necessarily that this is a totally new development, like called a new enterprise, but it's going to take a different form, because even though it existed in Texas, is one of the most dominant enterprises in Texas. It had been really cattle ranching, the dominant enterprise going back to the Spanish colonists. The Spaniards were the ones that introduced cattle in Texas in the late 1600s. And when they colonized Texas, the missions, for example, grazed cattle. They started building their own cattle ranches in the missions. And we're going to see also that the colonists, the Spanish colonists that arrived, also created their own cattle ranches by simply seizing wild cattle, because there was thousands of cattle roaming around quite freely in the ranges of Texas. And what people were doing was simply rounding up the cattle and creating their own small family-owned ranches. And we also saw, of course, the creation of the large, wealthy ranches as well. There were individuals, wealthy families, Spanish families that really owned a lot of land, and there were the wealthy ranchers as well. So cattle ranching has been pretty much established in Texas for quite a while. Something that continued in the Mexican period and also in the independence of Texas and the Texas Republic, likewise, and with the settlement of Americans coming again through the colonization laws that we examined. What we saw is that also there will be cowboys or cattle ranchers coming from the United States, bringing in their techniques, bringing their cattle, their breeds of livestock, and so on into Texas. They're introducing the enterprise that was so dominant in South Carolina. Cattle ranching was dominant in South Carolina, and they're going to introduce it in Texas. So it was already here. Cattle ranching was perhaps even the dominant enterprise in Texas, perhaps only rivaled by the cotton plantation in the past. But what we're going to see is that after Reconstruction, after 1876, 1877, this enterprise, what's called cattle ranching, is going to go industrial. In other words, the operation of cattle ranchers is not going to be confined to simply producing cattle for the regional market, because now there is a national market. There's now a growing demand for beef all over the United States. Okay, so now they have consumers all over the country, and because there's a transportation system, the railroads, well, you can now ship the product all over the country. And there's more people to feed now. There's growing cities. There are industrial cities, again, on the rise in the United States. So, of course, cattle ranchers in Texas are going to accommodate to this demand. And what they needed to do was really transform those small-scale type of enterprises that was only geared for a regional market, very regional, now to transform those enterprises into an industrial type of enterprise, an industrial ranch, in other words, the industrial cattle ranches. Now, this, again, was necessary, as I said, because there is a growing demand for cattle. Okay, a growing demand for cattle in the north part of the country. There is a demand for cattle. What the Civil War did was that it devastated a lot of the food supplies from many regions of the country. And what many producers and cattle ranchers really required was additional cattle for them to recover the lost animals that they had to slaughter so fast to supply the troops, etc. It was, again, the economies of the country were totally devastated because of the Civil War. So what northern cattle ranchers were trying to do was simply acquire more livestock, in other words, to kind of restart their business, because it had been depleted, it had been devastated. So there was a growing demand for cattle. So of course, Texas is going to now grow the cattle and try to send it up north again to northern cattle ranchers as well. But there's also another factor that must be taken into account, and that is that after the end of the Civil War, in the late 1860s, we're going to see a new technology on the rise, okay? A new piece of technology, and that is the refrigerator rail car, okay? The refrigerator rail car was invented in the late 1860s, which allow for meat to be refrigerated in rail cars, in wagons, in other words, and to be transported across state lines. So now you can actually transport beef all over the country because now you can preserve it. That was really impossible in the past. That's why cattle ranchers, again, had a very limited market, and their scope of operations was quite limited. It was very regional because meat couldn't be refrigerated in the past. We talked about beef jerky, for example. Yes, it's true. You have to cure the meat with salt to preserve it and so on. It tastes very salty and the like. But that was the only way you could preserve food, by actually rubbing salt into it and actually cooking it with salt. But now that you can refrigerate the meat, now you can actually transport that beef all over the country. And it can be preserved through refrigeration. Okay, so this invention, this innovation, again, this is a new sophisticated technology, is going to transform that industry. Cattle ranching is going to now become an industry in its own right. Okay, industrial ranching. There's a growing demand, once again, for cattle in the north, and the refrigerator rail car, what it's going to do is that it allows people to transport beef across state lines. And more Americans are going to now have access to beef in the local supermarket. Okay, that was something that was present in the past, but was limited as well. Because in order to eat beef in the United States prior to this time, you needed to have a cattle ranch quite nearby. And once the cattle was slaughtered, the meat had to be eaten, within, a very limited time frame because there was no refrigeration. Again, either you had to make the beef jerky or just, consume the beef right away. So the idea of today, where people simply go to the supermarket and there's just beef there sitting in refrigerators, that was not really present during this time. So therefore, the American diet, was not really based on beef consumption as it is today. But now there's more and more meat available in the supermarket, and as more and more Americans are eating beef, there's going to be a growing demand for beef now by Americans. Americans are demanding more and more beef. They are now just going to this grocery store. They see it there. Now they're buying it. So this is going to create a national demand for beef that Texas cattle ranchers are going to accommodate to. Okay, they're going to accommodate to this growing demand by now creating what is called an industrial ranch. And in this transition towards industrial ranching, cattle ranchers are trying to build an industry that is going to be very efficient. In other words, they're trying to determine what kind of cattle, what it will be the breed of cattle, for example, that will be more productive. Because there's many types of breeds. Again, when you really study ranching, for example, there's so many different breeds of animals, of livestock, and there are cows that you can actually feed certain diets, and you can, actually make them grow, weight to such an extent that you can actually extract the most amount of beef from that animal, which other animals cannot do. I mean, there's certain, again, genetic structures, if you will, in the breeds of cattle that allow some cattle to actually grow larger organisms than others, in other words. So that's exactly what Texas cattle ranchers are going to start studying. In other words, what will be the kind of business model, okay, that is going to be more productive, more efficient, in which we can actually produce more cattle, produce cattle that is going to be more productive in terms of weight, in terms of beef production. And they really were studying, again, different business models, because there's so many different cattle ranchers, cattle ranching models from around the world. And Texas cattle ranchers arrived to the conclusion, after careful consideration, that the Mexican ranch model was the most productive and the most efficient. So they even went to Mexico, given the fact that, again, Mexico had been growing and grazing cattle for centuries, ever since the Spaniards introduced cattle in the 1500s in Mexico. Cattle ranching, again, was perhaps the dominant form of enterprise in Mexico that most Mexicans were very familiar with. In other words, growing up in Mexico during this period of time, or in earlier decades and centuries, meant that more than likely that you were either growing inside of a ranch, or you were working for a rancher. Your family was actually working in the land of a rancher, a large hacienda owner, a large landowner. And those were actually skills that people acquire ever since they were little. It was very common for Mexicans to be growing around cattle, in other words, to be very skilled in managing cattle or horses and the like, the countryside, in other words. So Texas cattle ranchers are going to adopt the Mexican ranch model, because it was very productive in terms of the branding, for example, techniques, the rounding of animals, the roping, all of that, again, is going to now come to Texas. Texas is going to acquire the Mexican model for grazing cattle, for raising cattle, branding it, rounding it, roping it, and even, again, in the breed itself. Which is now an icon in Texas, the Longhorn, the Texas Longhorn. We tend to think that this is, an animal that somehow was native or indigenous to Texas somehow, but it was not. It was actually from Mexico. And this is the kind of breed that produces more meat, per volume. That is to say, you can actually feed certain diets, and you can actually, allow the animal to grow to such an extent that you can actually maximize the amount of meat that you can actually extract per unit. In other words, okay, so it's going to be very productive in that regard. Okay, the Mexican Longhorn, and it would become now the most preferred breed of cattle in Texas, to the point that this is going to become the kind of the central icon, again, of the Texas cowboy, of the Texas cattle rancher, again, the Longhorn, okay, which is actually, again, coming from Mexico, which, by the way, this is coming from Spain, okay, because all cattle came from Spain, for the most part. Okay, the Spaniards introduced cattle to the Americas. They were the forerunners of the cattle industry, cattle ranching, again, in the Americas, by the way. So now what we're going to see is that those cattle ranchers are going to try to mass produce. That's what industrial cattle ranching is that they want to maximize production. We want to graze thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of cattle, okay? Because it's almost like an industry. You're going to now use technologies, use certain knowledge to mass produce for the national market, okay? And what this is going to do is that the people that had the most capital, okay, the people that had the most money, are going to be the ones that are going to actually create those kinds of industrial ranches. Because what you need to create an industrial ranch is actually land, okay? Land and resources. You need water resources, but most particularly, you need land, large tracts of land, okay? Hundreds of thousands, perhaps even millions of acres, again, worth of land, okay? So the people that have the capital are going to build those, what is called cattle kingdoms, okay? The cattle kingdom. because those were the biggest ranches, not only of Texas. And I have to actually, again, specify here that the kind of cattle ranches, again, the industrial cattle ranches that we're going to see arising in Texas are going to be the largest in the world, by the way, in the world. Okay, it's not an exaggeration. It's actually, again, a historical fact, the largest in the world. Okay, they were known as the cattle kingdoms because even those cattle ranches, like, for example, the King Ranch in the Rio Grande Valley in Southeast Texas, was larger territorially than the Kingdom of Portugal, the King Ranch. So one ranch was actually larger territorially than the Kingdom of Portugal in Europe. So again, this is gigantic. Okay, and the scope of operations are also gigantic. It's an industrial size of enterprise here. Okay, and again, this is again in the Rio Grande Valley. It's a gigantic ranch. The King Ranch it was called. And the other industrial ranches that are going to also create this kind of industrial type of operation, industrial cattle ranching, are going to be in the Panhandle. Okay, we're going to see, of course, very wealthy investors, wealthy merchants, because you need capital, in other words, to have that kind of enterprise. If you're going to buy land, for example, we talk about industrial capitalism. You're going to have, capital to create an enterprise. Well, the more capital you got, the larger the enterprise. Okay, so in the Panhandle, we're going to see a series of what's called cattle tycoons, wealthy, very wealthy merchants, extremely wealthy, by the way. And they're going to build those industrial cattle ranches there. The Panhandle will become also another cattle kingdom in its own right. And there were several individuals, by the way. This is not owned by a single individual. There were several individuals that are going to be investing in lands there. Lands that actually were used initially to graze cattle there in what is called open ranges. In other words, that before they even bought the land, okay, what they did is that they just moved land into the Panhandle. There were open ranges there. They set the cattle loose, so the cattle will feed off the land. They will graze there, and they were already kind of seizing those lands, kind of claiming those lands. By the way, there's a seizure of lands in the open ranges of the Panhandle, and slowly but surely they're going to enclose the land. What they're doing is actually bringing in barbed wire, okay, and they're going to enclose the land in order to make sure that the cattle was not being stolen or is not really running away to other areas outside of Texas and the like, to confine the cattle inside of a property. And this is how they're going to build those cattle kingdoms, by the way. Okay, so this is giving rise, once again, to the cattle kingdoms that are the ones that are going to be generating eventually millions of units, millions of cattle again, that are going to be driven up north. For the most part, up north means out of state, moving into the upper states, the northern states. And again, this is cattle that will be eventually slaughtered and sold around the country, because now there's transportation purposes again. There's transportation facilities, okay, railroad and refrigerator car as well, the Railcar. Now, another very important development here is that in Texas, for example, in the Rio Grande Valley, particularly in the Rio Grande Valley, the area of Laredo, San Antonio, where those cattle ranchers are, what we're going to see is that the workforce, the ones that were actually branding, roping, the cattle, etc., working inside of those enterprises, not really not the investors, not the owners of the enterprises, but the workforce, for the most part, are going to be people of Mexican descent. Many of them were already here in Texas, the descendants of the Mexican population going back to the Spanish and Mexican periods. But a great many also are going to be newly arrived immigrants, again, that are coming from Mexico as well. And they're coming from Mexico precisely because there's growing enterprises in Texas. Okay, enterprises are growing. There are agricultural companies, there are cattle ranchers, and they're taking on jobs there. And the owners of those ranches hired the Mexican immigrants in many cases, or the Mexican American population, because they were very skilled. In other words, this is for them, this is skilled labor. In other words, the Mexicans know very well how to handle cattle. This is part of their upbringing. This is part of their culture. They have that skill that they learn, they acquire, again, from their own upbringing, whether it was in Mexico or here in Texas. So again, this is something very familiar that they can actually do. So this is one of the reasons, again, that we're going to see the rise that is called the Mexican Vaquero, the Mexican cowboy. That is to say, they were the ones that were driving the cattle, etc., rounding it up, etc., guiding it, and so on, branding, and so on. Again, because they were very skilled, and it will be now very typical, again, to see now Mexican vaqueros, the Mexican cowboys, that is to say. Okay, so very, very important. Another, very important development, again, of industrial ranching is the cattle trails. Okay, I mentioned cattle trails, that cattle had to be driven. Once it's produced, what cattle ranchers are doing, whether they are in the King Ranch, in the Rio Grande Valley, in San Antonio, Laredo, or they are in the Dallas-Fort Worth Panhandle area, what they're doing is that they're now driving thousands of cattle up north. What they're doing before they had access to the railroad, in other words, before there were any rail lines nearby, okay, what they had to do, because there was no other way to do it, is drive the cattle to the nearby train station, okay? That was before. Again, we're going to see massive railroad development in Texas. Again, the railroad is barely starting in Texas during this time, but it's a very gradual, very slow process, again, of transportation development. So what cattle ranchers were doing is driving the cattle up north to places like Kansas, Missouri, and Colorado. Again, those were the regions that had train stations. So by driving the cattle there, then it will be now easier to transport the cattle to the United States. Cattle that ended up either being sold to northern cattle ranchers, or cattle that will be actually taken to the city of Chicago, Illinois, because the city of Chicago, Illinois is really the main hub of the slaughterhouses and meatpacking plants. So all cattle arrives to Chicago, where it is being slaughtered in industries and is being packaged as well in the meat packaging plants, and is being distributed all over the country. Okay, so this is the purpose of the so-called cattle trails. By 1880, there's already 6 million cattle that have been driven, again, up north, through those very famous cattle trails. Those were actually legendary, by the way. There's been novels and movies, etc., being produced about the cattle trails, the Mexican cowboys driving cattle. Again, it took really months to do, by the way, but it was like a pilgrimage. It was like a journey. Again, it was people who were driving cattle. There was many dangers along the way, etc. But the cowboy had to make sure to deliver, again, the cattle to the train stations in Kansas, in Missouri, and in Colorado. You can see here, this is the King Ranch right here in the Rio Grande Valley, and they were driving the cattle up north. Again, this is before we're going to see massive railroad development, again, in Texas. So before the railroad arrived, this is what cattle ranchers are doing, but it's already going industrial. Okay, it's an industrial now type of enterprise. Okay, now let me now explain another industry Okay, that is going to transform the economy of Texas forever. So much that when we talk about the Texas economy, even today, uh, a great portion of the Texas economy is really based on the so-called energy industries. So I mentioned that initially, when Texas was beginning to industrialize, the lumber industry was dominant. Let's say from the 1870s to, let's say, the 1890s, it was the dominant industry. And cattle ranching was coming as a close second, okay, back during that time. But as we move in the latter part of the 1890s and into the early part of the 1900s, the energy industries are going to really eclipse all the other industries of Texas. And this is going to be the primary, source of industrial production that sustained now the entire economy of the state. The Texas economy really depends on energy production. Okay, so there are two sources of energy. One is going to become more important than the other, but it's very critical to talk about the two sources of energy in which generated most of the industries, in Texas. For example, the first energy industry was the coal industry. Okay, this is the fuel of the Industrial Revolution up to this time that we're talking about. Let's say when still we're talking the 19th century. When we talk about the Industrial Revolution, it was coal. That was the fuel of industry. It was the fuel of the steel plants to smelt the iron ore into steel or iron. Okay, that was the fuel of the railroads. That was the fuel of the steamships and so on. Again, so that was really, the life force of the Industrial Revolution up to this time. Because this is so central for industry, there is going to be, again, significant coal exploration taking place in the United States. This mineral deposits, fossil fuels that are being discovered all over the country. There's even gold being discovered in places like Oklahoma, the Dakota, etc. There's a lot of exploration taking place, scientific exploration. And because there's just a lot of scientific exploration, because people are trying to find sources of mineral wealth or energy in Texas in 1879, there will be a significant discovery of coal. Okay, coal discovery in Stephen County. Again, Stephen County in 1879, and this is again good news for Texas because now there's going to be an energy industry. The coal industry is considered an energy industry. Okay, for the steam engines, railroads are going to be the ones that are going to be really the main customers again of coal, Texas coal. Not just Texas railroads, by the way, national railroads, all railroads all throughout the country require, of course, coal for their functioning, and Texas is now generating coal, again, for the railroads. Okay, it's very important. And the revenues, again, of this coal industry in Texas is going to rise from 1 million in 1870 to 5 million in 1900. So this is, again, from the perspective, just from an economic perspective, this was, great news in Texas that, people realized that there was natural wealth in Texas. Texas was rich, had a lot of land for agriculture, for cattle ranching, for cotton production, for crops, and so on. Plenty of rivers, good rain patterns, and the like. So people always knew that it was quite wealthy. But now they're finding energy, okay, like coal. But as I said, the other energy source that is going to also, there's going to be a great discovery of this energy source in Texas. This is going to really lead to really the largest, the greatest industry in Texas, and that is the oil industry. Okay, the oil industry is going to eclipse really all the other industries that we have mentioned so far. The lumber industry, for example, or the salt mines, or cattle ranching and the like, even though cattle ranching is extremely profitable, by the way, because this is a food product that has a national market. But oil is going to have an international market. Okay, it's not just regional or national demand, but there's a world demand again for oil. And as we'll see, as the 20th century opens up more and more, the whole world is moving towards oil now. Is really moving away from coal, and it's going to be moving towards oil, by the 20th century. So the first, as I mentioned, there's really a lot of exploration taking place. Okay, there's scientists, there's engineers, physicists, chemists that are pretty much exploring the natural resources, the natural wealth of the entire country, by the way. So this is not exclusive to one state. This is a national research project, and it is in Texas that in 1894 there's going to be yet another discovery, okay, of another energy source, another energy resource, and that is oil. Okay, the first oil well was discovered in Corsicana in 1894, which attracted, after that discovery was made, which was really, those explorations were really sponsored by investors, by the way. There were, investors that will commission scientists or mining engineers, etc., to do explorations. They get, the engineers often got grants, from investors in order to do explorations. And once those explorations were made and people discovered things like oil, like in Texas, then the investors are going to come in. They're going to rush, and they're going to now bring capital into Texas, and they're going to create an industry. So that's exactly what happened in Texas, is that after that first oil well was first discovered in Corsicana, we're going to see Pennsylvania investors. They're going to be very wealthy investors arriving to Texas. They bring capital, and what they're going to do is pretty much start building the first industries, the first oil industries, because now Texas has oil, and now they're going to extract it out of the ground. There will be industrial plants that are going to be pumping the oil and storing it in barrels, etc. And the oil will be, initially, the idea is to be shipped out, to be processed again in different states, in other states where there's refineries, of course, to refine the oil. There's, at this time, in the United States, oil was still used, for industry. There's a lubricant. In other words, there's used as a lubricant for machinery in various industries. Railroads also use a derivative of oil as well, as a form of lubricant as well, and oil lamps. Again, people are still using oil lamps to light up their homes in many places where people don't have electricity yet, by the way. So where there's no electrical companies, people are still relying on oil lamps. And the oil industry was quite limited during this time, but it was still an industry, by the way. And so Texas, initially from 1894 onwards, once the Pennsylvania investors arrive, is going to be generating about 866,000 barrels a year. This is, again, how much oil is being produced. Texas is extremely wealthy when it comes to oil. Okay, and that led, of course, to, instead of shipping the oil, outside to be refined, that led to the need to actually refine the oil in the state. Well, the oil is already here, and it will be so costly to ship it out, to the refineries located elsewhere. So why not just build the refineries in the state, in other words? Okay, so that led to the investors, many of whom are actually coming from out of state, by the way, to start building this form of free enterprise again. They're creating the refineries. Okay, we're going to see, for example, the Magnolia Petroleum Company, that was otherwise known as Mobil. Okay, Magnolia Petroleum Company, or Mobil, in other words, that are now creating, again, the first refinery in Texas. It started out as simply a refinery to refine the crude oil into derivatives, in other words, like lubricants, for example, or another form of oil that can be used for combustion, as a form of not necessarily gasoline. Gasoline will be developed in the early 1900s, but right now people use it for combustion. In other words, what railroads are going to be doing is actually changing their steam engines to run on oil. So instead of using coal, to heat up the water, those boilers, to actually boil the water to produce steam, so the steam can actually propel the railroads. What they're going to do is to switch to an engine that is going to run on oil instead. Okay, so again, the railroads are kind of initiating this transition towards oil as a form of energy, an energy that transportation systems are going to use. That they're discarding the old source of fuel, coal, in favor of oil. Again, so this is something that the Magnolia Petroleum Company in Texas is actually doing. It's actually refining the crude oil to produce oil as a form of combustion, as a source of fuel for railroads, and the railroads are the ones actually buying the oil from Mobil initially. Okay, and it was considered to be a very important industry, by the way, but not yet, a gigantic enterprise, not yet. It was considered to be an emerging industry up to this time, except when in 1901 there will be another oil discovery in Spindletop that is going to pretty much change once and for all the oil industry in Texas. Instead of being simply a small scale type of industrial operation, this is going to become massive, gigantic operation, because this was a grand discovery. This was a major discovery in Texas, the oil discovery in Spindletop in 1901. Again, suddenly, again, it will be so much, oil being produced here that when the first oil well was discovered, the spillage of the oil in Spindletop was so much that in a few days there were like 500,000 barrels that were spilled. And just, again, the explosion of that vein outward, it was just gigantic. So they realized there was just a lot of oil that they were sitting on a gigantic pool of oil, that Texas was sitting on a gigantic pool of oil, that is to say. So this gave rise to what's called black gold. Okay, black gold, that oil is going to become so valuable in the world for transportation purposes, particularly. This is going to be the engine of the 20th century. That this is going to be, one of the most precious, valuable sources of energy, one of the most precious, valuable natural resources, period. Again, is black gold, a new energy resource. And again, the world after this will be moving now towards oil. After Spindletop, there will be exploration in the East Coast. This was in the Gulf Coast, by the way, Spindletop. But in the following years, starting in the 1900s, 1910s, 1920s, even into the 1930s, there will be more oil exploration in the north and south part of Texas as well. Okay, so this is not just confined to the East Coast and the Gulf Coast, but rather all of Texas. The entire state was actually sitting on top of a gigantic pool of oil. That even in the north and in the south part of Texas, there will be significant discoveries as well, exploration and discoveries. And over 491 companies, oil companies, will be chartered. They will be given a legal right to exist, to operate. They were created as legal entities, that is to say, that were given the rights to explore and drill and extract oil in different parts of Texas. 491 oil companies were created. You can see in this map, again, all of the oil fields again, that are going to emerge in the early decades of the 1900s, let's say from 1901 all the way to the 1930s. You can see in this map, you go to the outline on Blackboard, you can actually see very closely by year, when those oil fields were actually created, exactly the same, the exact year. Again, so this is early 20th century, by the way. So this is a totally new industry that is going to, once again, really overshadow all of the other industries, because oil is going to be exported all over the United States, and is going to be also an energy source that is going to be running the entire economy of the world, even today. Again, the entire world economy runs on oil, by the way. Okay, so Texas in 1902 was producing 21 million barrels of oil, but by 1929, as a result of the multiplicity of different companies that were chartered in different parts of the state to drill the oil, to extract the oil, there were already 293 million barrels extracted by 1929. I repeat, 293 million barrels by 1929. By 1929, 13,000 people were employed in the oil industry, or in the industries that were connected to it. Okay, there would be a number of industries that were actually connected to the oil industry, by the way. Okay, so let me just talk about the petroleum-based industries, okay? Because when we talk about the oil industry, this is just too generalized. In other words, now we need to be more specific. In Texas, what we're going to see is that there were different kinds of enterprises that were totally centered on oil extraction, oil production, oil processes, manufacturing, and the like of different kinds. Okay, so it's like a conglomerate of different kinds of industries. The first one is the most important, again, is the oil corporation. Again, this is a company in which there's a group of investors that come in and actually join capital. Okay. And what they do is that they create a gigantic company, that is to say, okay, and a company that will be dominant in specific regions of Texas. They're going to be, chartered and titled to actually be extracting those mineral resources, to be generating, again, the oil for the state, and to be selling the oil to the other industries that are going to process it as well. Okay, the oil corporation, the Houston Oil Company, will be one of the forerunners of the oil corporations, again, centered in Houston. For example, Houston, Texas. The J.M. Guffey Petroleum Company will be another one. The Gulf Oil, J.S. Cullinan, will be another one as well. And the Sun Oil Company. Again, so there was a series of corporations. This is not just one. It's a series of corporations that are on the rise in the early 1900s as a result of Texas now moving towards, again, towards an oil economy. That's exactly what is really going to happen here, is that Texas is now, moving towards an oil economy. If you want to use an analogy, for example, when we talk about, for example, the pre-Civil War years, okay, Texas was the Texas economy was based on cotton. It was a cotton-based economy because this is the primary product that Texas was producing and exporting to the world. That was also considered gold, by the way. It's called white gold, cotton back then, because the growing demand, etc., worldwide. And it really, cotton production and cotton exports sustained the economy of the state. Okay, it's a cotton-based economy. It's called king cotton, in other words. So that's a very useful analogy because now, as Texas is moving to an oil-based economy, the exact same thing is happening, but now with oil. It's no longer cotton, it's oil. It's called black gold, and this is going to be the kind of industry that is going to generate most of the jobs, most of the revenues for the state. This is where the state is going to collect most of the taxes from oil sales, from oil exports, etc., from the property of those industries and the like. Okay, so the entire Texas economy more and more is going to rely on oil from this point onwards. Okay, so there's going to be another type of a petroleum-based industry that is going to be deeply connected to the oil corporation, and that is the refinery. Okay, so we mentioned the refinery. There's going to be now more refineries in Texas because there's more oil now. There's more corporations, and each is centered in different parts of Texas, and they're extracting the oil. And what they're going to do is, send it to the refinery where this crude oil is going to be processed, is going to be refined. In other words, into different derivatives. Those are products that derive from crude oil, like oils, for example, different kinds of oils and lubricants, for motors, for example, like oil motors and the like, and stuff like that. Gasoline, this is the beginning stages of the automobile industry, something that we're going to talk about, of course, in the future, in a future topic towards the end of the semester, by the way. Diesel as well for tractors, diesel for large trucks, trailers, and the like that also run on diesel. Petroleum gas and asphalt. Asphalt is to actually build roads, to build paved streets and highways. Asphalt as well for transportation purposes, for the automobiles, for trucks, etc. Okay, so again, one of the most important refineries of Texas was the Humble Oil and Refining Company. Okay, and also the Texas Company Refinery as well. Those two particular refineries are the ones that are actually crafting those oil derivatives that I just mentioned. And it was really the Texas Company Refinery that is going to build pipelines again. Those are really pipelines that are going to actually connect the oil fields in Oklahoma all the way to East Texas, the refineries in Port Arthur that are going to refine the oil coming from Oklahoma. Okay, so there's going to be now new forms of developments, pipelines again, in which crude oil is going to be transported across those pipelines all the way to Port Arthur, where the oil extracted in Oklahoma will be also refined as well. Okay, so there is an industrial revolution taking place in Texas, particularly as we move into the early 20th century. Again, it's really accelerating, to new heights, to new levels. And of course, the petrochemical industry in 1923. Okay, there's going to be another petroleum-based industry that is also going to be connected to the oil industry, to the larger oil industry, to the oil corporations. Again, it's the petrochemical plants that are the ones actually transforming the crude oil into, once again, lubricants, plastic. For example, plastic comes from oil, rubber, to make tires, for example, the tires of the automobiles, etc., are source of rubber. Again, fiber, raw materials, and the like. Those are actually products that through chemical processes are extracted or crafted out of the crude oil. Okay, so by 1923, there's a petrochemical industry in Texas as well. So once again, this is part of the industrial revolution in Texas that is really transforming the Texas economy once and for all. Texas is now entering this modern industrial capitalist economy, industrial capitalism, that is to say. And there's a lot of industries that are generating wealth, by extracting resources or creating food products, or like cattle or crops, or extracting coal or extracting oil and processing it in order to sell it on the market. And there's now going to be millions of people that are going to be hired in those industries and earning wages as well. Now, last but not least, the last, again, portion of, this transition of Texas towards a modern economy and a modern society, is Texas now giving rise to modern urban centers. Okay, the modern metropolitan cities again. So it was not just transportation systems like railroads. It was not just a commercial industrial economy with commercial farming, commercial agriculture, and a host of industries, but also society is modernizing. Texas society is going to modernize because more and more people are going to now live in cities. Okay, so the city itself is considered to be a modern setting for people to live. Okay, people are now moving away from the countryside, from the rural areas, from the countryside, and they're going to be moving gradually, particularly as we move into the 20th century. They're going to be moving now into those cities. There's going to be, of course, demographic growth. Part of the reasons why we're going to see people moving to the cities is, well, the cities are attracting people, by the way. It's true. There's a lot of labor, scarcity of labor. There's a lot of jobs that are scarce that the industries require. That will attract people. But at the same time, that the reason why those cities are growing is because there's also migrations. There's also people coming from out of state. There's also people coming from Mexico. They're moving into Texas. And this is another reason why those cities are going to grow as well. Okay. So those cities were attracting labor. Okay. And people that wanted to take a job in those cities, in the refineries, for example, or in the salt mines, for example, in the lumber industries, they're attracted to those urban centers by the tens of thousands. And many people are coming also from out of state. There's migrations of people. Again, people are migrating to the urban centers, to the industrial centers as well. And so there's people that come with skills, and there's also people that come with no skills. In other words, there's professionals, there's educated people that are migrating to the city to become an administrator, a supervisor, an engineer, and the like. But at the same time, there's people that simply want to take a non-skilled type of job, in other words, to run a machine, etc., work on a mine, etc. So again, this is part of what is really going on in Texas. Skilled and unskilled labor, again, is part of this changing demographics that we're going to see the rise of cities because there's people arriving in search for work. Some people are educated, they have degrees, they're going to be in the management, the managerial, professional departments. Some others are going to be, again, in the industrial production, again, of those products. Okay. And also, again, another very important development here of the modern cities in Texas is women. Women are entering now the workforce, particularly after World War I. When World War I breaks out in 1914, what we're going to see is that a lot of men actually left the countryside. A lot of men left industrial jobs to sign up for the army to go and fight, of course, in Europe, okay, during World War I. So many jobs were left vacant, okay, and it was essential that somebody will come in and take those jobs. It's true, a lot of people migrated there to take the jobs, but now the men are leaving, okay? They're going to Europe and fight. So there's vacancies, there's hundreds of thousands of jobs that need to be done that women are going to fill in, okay? There's going to be industrial jobs that they're going to actually take after or during the First World War, okay? And there's going to be telephone operators as well. There are going to be clerical workers, teachers, nurses, librarians. They're moving now into those cities and actually taking jobs in many different areas, again, of the economy, not just in factories, but also, again, as secretaries, as administrators, nurses, etc. There's a wide variety. So they enter the workforce. Okay, this is what we call the feminization of labor. It's in some historians actually call it that, This is when finally women are entering the workforce. And so we're going to see large metropolitan cities now in Texas. Again, this is the modern city, like Houston, that is already reaching 292,000 people in the early 20th century because of the oil industries that were there, because it was an international port. It has this Houston Ship Channel that was, the central exit point and entry point for international shipping. This is going to be one of the large industrial centers of Texas, Houston. So this is a whole new development. Okay, Texas is changing. The society is changing because more and more people are now living in industrial cities and they're working for industries. Fort Worth reaching 163,000. 163,000 people in Fort Worth. This is becoming also one of the largest cities in Texas. Was labeled as the cow town because this was a place where cattle ranchers are going to bring in the cattle, station it there in stockyards, and once the railroad came in, this is where the railroad is going to ship out the cattle up north. Once the railroad arrived again to Fort Worth, is going to be well known for being a hub for cattle ranchers, the industrial cattle ranchers of the Panhandle that were actually shipping out the cattle up north. Okay, Dallas, 260,000 people, and plus, again, in the early 20th century, financial and business center. Okay, is becoming again also very, very significant because of this is a center for finance. It finances investors, merchants that are investing in enterprises, in cattle ranches, etc., transportation development, you name it. There's going to be finance there. It was in Texas, and it's also a business center as well. Okay, so it's another city that is attracting hundreds of thousands of people. And eventually, again, by the mid 20th century, we're going to be looking at, over 1 million people plus again in Dallas again. And most of the cities again of Texas are going to now move into the millions in the 20th century. Okay, San Antonio, 231,000 people plus in San Antonio. This is a place that was in the early 20th century a center for manufacturing. It had a military base as well. And also there was a tourist industry as well in San Antonio, a tourist industry. Attracted tourists for visit the colonial heritage of Spain. In other words, like the missions, for example, like the Alamo, for example, okay, tourism. So again, this is something that is also going to become an industry in its own right that allow the merchants, commerce in San Antonio to make money. There's visitors that are attracted there. They provide lodging, accommodation, restaurants, etc. to them, tours. And this is how people are going to earn their living as well. They're accommodating to this demand. El Paso, Texas is another large city on the rise, 102,000 people plus in the early 20th century. Known for its smelting centers and mining centers as well, smelting metals, smelting iron ore, and mining again. So once again, the social landscape of Texas is also modernizing. People are not just confined to the countryside, growing their own food and simply living the life of a simple farmer, for example, or grazing cattle, etc. That was the traditional form of living, making a living in the past. That is coming to an end. More and more people are becoming city dwellers. They dwell in cities. They work for industries. They earn wages. There's a host of different enterprises on the rise, and it's a whole new. Again, this is a whole new Texas. It's modern. It's new. Okay. There's going to be in those cities the development of city services like electricity companies, for example. Okay, there's going to be now electricity arriving in the early 20th century to provide, of course, that service to homes, to businesses, to office, and the like. In the Houston area, we're going to see Dallas, Fort Worth, the Texas Power and Light Company, for example. Okay, a very important electrical, company providing that service to those large metropolitan cities. Natural gas companies as well. There was natural gas being sold as well for people to actually use natural gas for things like cooking, for example, and the stoves and the like for bakeries and so on. So it's another demand. It's another type of service that is really becoming now integral to city living. System of roads and highways as well. Okay, there's going to be road highway development, in the 1910s and 20s with the coming of the automobile. We're going to see mass transportation now, people owning automobiles, and they're going to be, of course, in the cities using the automobile to drive around, going to work, etc., going groceries, visiting families, and the like. Okay, and there's going to be paved roads, again, along with this. Okay, and there's also going to be leisure and entertainment facilities as well in the cities, in which people are going to spend a good amount of time, particularly during the weekends, with family members and friends, kind of relaxing, having a good time, spending time away from work and trying to pretty much relax in public parks, zoos, swimming pools, ballparks, for example, leisure and entertainment. This is what the city has to offer as well. Okay, this is what you find in the growing cities of Texas. Okay, something new, by the way. And as well, the city was also the center for education systems. Okay, this is where people actually are educated. It is really in the city. This is not the exclusive setting, the exclusive place, but this is where you find, of course, now more and more people investing in trying to foster what is called a high-tech society. This is where people say we need to really prepare the future generations to live in this futuristic high-tech civilization, industrial civilization. And the way to do it is to educate our children, educate the youth. So in Texas, as early as 1884, we're going to see the coming of the public education system. Okay, the law of 1824 created the public education system in Texas. That is the one that we still hold today, dividing Texas, the cities of Texas into school districts, for example, each governed by a superintendent. Okay, that is going to be the administrator of the school district that sustain the schools that are part of that district with taxes. It's called property taxes, district property taxes, of course, and is going to require teachers to obtain certifications. In other words, that they will be qualified to teach in those public education systems, again, elementary, junior high, high school, again. So you need to really develop, again, knowledge. You need to transmit knowledge in order to guarantee that the future generations are going to continue with modernity. In other words, they're going to be trained in the sciences and the arts and the technologies, again, that is so essential to develop the economy of the state. And of course, higher education. There's going to be very intense efforts to invest in higher education, universities, in other words, to offer degrees in science, technology, law, the liberal arts, and there will be degrees that people are going to obtain, for example, to make sure that the oil industry, it will be innovated, improved in the future, okay? Because this is the central industry of Texas. For example, degrees in in petroleum engineering, for example. There's going to be new degrees, again, in the universities, petroleum engineering, petroleum geology, for example, oil and gas law, for example. Those are the kind of technical or technological academic degrees that, again, the higher education in Texas are going to offer. Like Texas A&M, for example, in 1871. Okay, the Texas Agricultural and Mechanical College, as it was called, Texas A&M, chartered in 1871. That the idea was to create a university that are going to create the agricultural scientists, again, of the future. And scientific agriculture for agricultural companies and farmers. So we need expertise. We need the latest science, the latest technological developments, again, to be used in the agricultural center and cattle ranching as well. So this university is going to train, again, the future agricultural companies and the scientists that are going to be running this sector, the agrarian sector. Okay, and again, this is one example. And UT, University of Texas, that was actually chartered as early as 1836, but it's not going to really take effect. It's not going to start really functioning in a serious way until 1889. Again, that it was also chartered for the purpose of training the future generations to function in this technological, scientific, society. It was actually to be headquartered in Austin. Particularly, it is going to also have a branch in Galveston. The medical school is going to be headquartered in Galveston, Texas, and again is going to train the future generations in the academic and law degrees that are so essential for the peoples of Texas to operate in this new technological civilization. So in sum, what we learned here in this third topic, again, is that Texas initiates modernization starting in 1876. And it did so first and foremost with railroad development. We talked about that again, starting in session 2, railroad development. It also modernized with the introduction or the institution of a commercial industrial economy. It's called industrial capitalism. Producing for the market, allowing individuals to own property so they can create enterprises called free enterprise, so they can actually produce products for the market and allow people to actually earn wages as well, a wage labor economy as well. We're going to see different industries, manufacturing centers, shops, cattle ranches, energy companies of all kinds flourishing during this period of time. And along with that came, of course, large modern urban centers. There's, of course, demographic growth. There's migrations taking place in the cities. We're going to see creation of social classes, skilled labor, and unskilled labor. Again, the industrial working class, the middle class, the professional class. Again, this is, part of that. The feminization of labor that we talked about, women entering the workforce. Again, it's part of that, modernization. Public utilities and services, electricity, for example, paved roads, public parks, zoos, and the like, again, and natural gas companies, and also education systems. Again, this is part of a change that now is moving Texas into this modern age that is now increasing in an accelerating rate in the 20th century. Something that we're going to see, of course, in the following topics. This is the end, again, of the seventh topic, modernity and progress comes to Texas. This is the end of it. Then when we come back, we're going to actually initiate the first session of the eighth topic of the semester that we're going to come, again, see Texas during the age of reforms. Again, something that we can actually, of course, talk about when we come back. That's all I have for you, and I'll see you then in session 8. Thank you.